Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us today for YouGov's COVID-19 Consumer Behaviour Update and launch of our Economic Recovery Tracking. My name is Will Alstein and I'm joined by Jake Gammon today. Hello Jake, how are you?
Hey everyone, hi, I'm good, thank you.
Fantastic. So what we're going to talk about today, and I'm delighted to see that we've been joined by clients from, a very large part of the globe actually. I'm looking at people from Sydney through to Dubai by the looks of it. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening to you, wherever you are in the world. What we're going to talk about today is I'm going to update you a little bit on YouGov's work on COVID-19, how we are continuing to service the public good. Jake is then going to go on to talk about some of the insights from our commercial data. So looking first of all at our COVID-19 consumer monitor that we've now had up and running, certainly in APAC, since the middle of February. And then is going to introduce you to some of the new data that we've been collecting over the last 2 weeks, which is based around economic recovery. I'll then come back at the end to talk about future developments and what you can expect from YouGov next. Throughout this webinar, we would love to hear your questions. There is a chat functionality on this Zoom, so please do use that, jot them down as we go, and Jake and I will come back to them at the end and try and get through as many questions as we possibly can. So without further ado, let's crack on. YouGov's priority right now, as established by our CEO, when COVID-19 first was declared a pandemic, was to serve the public good. And what do we mean by that? Well, what we mean is by giving everybody the opportunity around the world to contribute to the discussion, to have their voice heard, to consolidate that data in a meaningful way and then deliver that to those organizations that are making a difference. And as part of that deliver data to organizations that are making a difference, we have partnered with the Institute of Global Health Innovation at Imperial College London. This is one of the world leading centers for epidemiology and infectious disease study. What we've done, in conjunction with the team at Imperial College, is create a behavioral tracker across many markets globally to enable us to track data around what is the population doing. We're then delivering that data back to Imperial and offering the insights from that data to policymakers and health officials around the world, including the World Health Organization. Our data is available from that behavioral tracker through COVID-19datahub.com and is also been made open source via GitHub as well. And in terms of how that knowledge is being used, or that data is being used, CAP studies, or knowledge, attitude and behavior studies, are used by policymakers and by health organizations around the world in the same way that many market studies are used by marketeers. It is to help them better understand the population, understand how they are feeling, understand how they are they willing to take action and their readiness to comply with messages from government. And the applications of those insights are then taken to create meaningful nudges for the population to effect change. And that study, in that terms of that behavioral data, well, that covers things around symptoms, testing, people's response to self-isolation, the number of people that people come into contact with around the home. And that study is being conducted across 29 markets. As I said, there's an example of one of the one pages that we're creating here. The data is available on GitHub. It's also available on COVID-19 Data Hub. But that's the behavioral data that we're putting into the public domain through our relationship with Imperial College. YouGov is also releasing a series of public data. This is made available on YouGov's website and is a selection of questions taken from our commercial tracking data. It's free to download at yougov.com/free COVID-19 tracker. And there's some interactive charts that you can look at, so you can cut data by region, you can cut data by individual country, and you can see that as a time series data. So we've got about 400,000 surveys and counting that are displayed across that public data. For those of you that are subscribers to YouGov's data, in particular Brandindex and Profiles, you will also find that we have enhanced those tools with some of the questions from our COVID tracker. So for Brandindex globally, our level of concern question has been added to all markets. And where possible, we've updated Profiles with some of the key data points from our COVID-19 monitor, so that you can really drill into understanding those audiences by all the other rich and colorful variables that we hold in Profiles. If you do need any help with understanding those, then please do contact your local account team. But let me finally get on to YouGov's COVID-19 commercial solutions. So this is what we've been running. These are the data that you will hear about from Jake later on in this presentation. And our commercial offering goes above and beyond our public data to give greater depth, greater color, and is collected as we've gone on feedback from clients and adapted the survey accordingly. Data is delivered via our very powerful crunch mechanism on a weekly basis, and clients are able to buy in for an 8-week period at a time. We set it as 8 weeks so that it wasn't an overly long commitment that clients had to make, and we priced it very competitively as well. Now, as we've gone on, this has evolved. We are now moving into our second block of 8 weeks, which actually started last week. As a result, we've made changes to that, to the underlying consumer monitor questions that we asked. And the reason that we've made those changes is, for example, one of the first questions that we asked back in February was, are you aware of coronavirus or COVID-19? That question, or the response to that question, was at nearly 100% in all markets. As such, the data isn't that useful anymore, so we've retired that and replaced that question with new and more interesting questions, which the data will be more useful about. So most of those changes occur in the levels of concern area, where we're talking about perceptions of global concern, about the impacts of coronavirus. The areas that remain broadly unchanged are where we talk about changes in consumer spending or media consumption. And of course, there are throughout the world some local tailoring of questions. For example, we don't ask people's opinion of government reaction in China, and there are other such local tailoring that go on around the world. We have this time as well, for this block of 8 weeks, added some new questions. Those new questions are around economic recovery. It's offered as an optional extension to your base subscription. So if you subscribe to the Consumer Monitor, you can add these economic recovery questions to your subscription. Again, we break them down into 3 areas. We look at confidence and outlook, unemployment, and changing consumer habits. Confidence and outlook looks at how people's financial situation has changed recently and what do they believe will change in the future. We also look at people's employment situation, so their perceptions of job security and levels of activity at their current employer. And then the final section looks at what are the certain habits that consumers have learnt as a result of the virus or as a result of lockdown and are likely to be more sticky in the future. So for example, for those people that have been able to and worked from home much more under lockdown, will they likely continue that behavior once lockdown restrictions are eased around the world? So those are the broad question areas that we cover under economic recovery. In terms of just a brief word on timing before we get on to the main event, but as I said, we're entering block 2. It's our second week, our second 8-week block, should I say. That runs from last week until the end of June. After which, we are highly likely to run block 3, another block of 8 weeks, but that will be confirmed in the coming weeks. What we're also doing, and especially relevant for this audience today, is that YouGov is bringing all of our markets into line. We started our COVID-19 tracking in APAC 3 weeks ahead of the rest of the world. And what we are doing is bringing all of our trackers into line to make that, one, easier for our clients to manage and understand, but also two, from our point of view, to make that operationally more efficient. Now, more than enough of me. Let's get on to Jake, who's going to walk us through data from block 1 and what we have seen to date. Jake, over to you.
Thank you, Will, and hello everyone again, and thank you all for joining. So I'm going to go through the 2 parts that Will kind of mentioned there today. First off, we're going to go through the consumer monitor and look at everything from people's base kind of primal level of fear and concern about the virus through to what impact that has on their spend in a number of different categories. And this is really important for us as employers to understand how our workers are doing, but also importantly as businesses to understand where our consumers are at and how we can best serve them. And then we're going to look at that economic data. We have pilot data from the US, UK and Australia that we can look at, and we will be able to look at that and understand what's happening in a wider global context, and so that we can see that conversation, see how the conversation has been shifting for our consumers. So let's look at consumer data first. And just a quick note on method, because as a researcher, you probably appreciate we love talking about method first. So for this first part, we're going to cover 14 markets in all. We are tracking in 14 markets across the APAC and MENA regions. We are going to cover data from all of those markets. However, we're going to focus more on the 11 listed here than we are on Vietnam, Taiwan, and Philippines. Apologies for that, it's just space on slides and time to talk about markets, but we do have some comparisons from those. Each market is nationally representative or online representative, sampled and weighted by demographic splits within that market to be representative of that market. I will also be calling out some demographic differences. When I call them out, if I call something out, it is significantly different from the statistical sense, so that we know that it's a real difference, not just a kind of blip or accident in the data, if you like. As mentioned by Will, we do have a lot of information on our website, so do ask questions and feel free to use that afterwards as well. So let's start with the level of fear that people are feeling in each market. So we are seeing that the level of fear, if you joined us for the last webinar, you might notice that this has actually gone down a little. What is staying kind of similar though, or what's interesting, is that the proportions within the region, the patterns of who is most fearful are staying very similar. So we can see that Southeast Asia are the most fearful across the regions we are covering here as a whole region, from Singapore at 71% through to Malaysia at 85%. Interestingly here though, we have Japan, which is where people are feeling the largest level of fear. The question is about fear of contracting the virus themselves, and the Japanese are the most concerned about contracting the virus. If you joined us for that last webinar, and you remember, there was a huge jump about 6 weeks ago where levels were quite low in Japan, and then suddenly it shot up. And it's remained at those high levels ever since. And when we compare that to Hong Kong and China with its North Asian neighbours, it's so much higher than those regions, which tend to be relatively kind of low in themselves, despite being the first hit. The Middle East falls somewhere in between these kind of Asian bloc of countries, with about 7 in 10 people concerned about contracting the virus in the Middle East. India are below the average of Asia at 62%. And lowest overall, we have Australia, where actually fewer people are scared of contracting the virus there compared to those who are not scared. Actually, it's the only place where we see that more people are not scared to scared. From when we looked at this about a month ago, as Will says, we've been tracking this every week, but last time I kind of, we did a webinar a month ago. All markets have fallen in their levels of fear, apart from Japan, which has remained steady, and Indonesia, which interestingly has risen by 8 percentage points. The biggest improvers are Hong Kong, which has dropped level of fear by 8 percentage points, Australia 9, and Thailand 11. Middle East and others not mentioned have dropped slightly, but not significantly over that time. So if we look a little bit at the demographics of those who are concerned, and again, the reason why we're looking at fear is this has a major impact on how we operate as businesses, what the consumer temperament is like, and how we can best serve those consumers. So we know that markets don't act as one block. We can talk about individual markets, but not everyone within those act the same. And when we look at age here, we can see quite an interesting story. What I think a lot of us would expect to see without the data, we know the virus has disproportionately impacted older people. They tend to have worse health outcomes if they contract the virus. That said, they are not the people who are most concerned about contracting the virus. And this may be due to success in government campaigning and government measures and messaging, and it may be that those generations are feeling more confident because they are listening to those and they are staying inside. Actually, what we're seeing is that there are two patterns among this, but if we look at the top one where you've got Thailand and Hong Kong there, you can see that younger people are actually the most fearful. So Generation Z, the youngest that we survey, they tend to be the most fearful in Thailand and in Hong Kong. Both markets, it's pretty even in levels of fear between Gen Z and millennials, the next generation up. And in those markets, it's then falling by age. So with Gen X less concerned, and then boomers. And then the other pattern that we see is this upside down U-shape pattern in Australia. And actually we see this a lot when we look at age throughout the work that we've been doing on COVID-19, where actually Gen Z and boomers are relaxed, but actually it's millennials and Gen X that are the most concerned, and we will see that again. Just one noticeable difference to this is Japan again, where actually fear is rising with age. So in Japan, it is the oldest generations who are the most concerned, and that rises to 9 in 10 people age 65 plus. Some other demographics to mention, women tend to be more fearful of contracting the virus than men. And we will notice throughout this webinar that the virus and the impact it's having on our daily lives is actually having a larger impact on women than it is on men. And so that's something to note. So women are more concerned than men. Parents, perhaps understandably, are more concerned about contracting the virus. And full-time workers in many markets. So what does fear do to us? Do we change our behavior? And are we changing our behavior in line with our change in fear? Or is that a cultural thing? Is that due to messaging? Well, we're looking at a couple of measures here to understand. So these percentages you see in front of you are an average across all of the markets for our latest few waves of the data. And what we can see is that the majority of people are improving their personal hygiene, they're avoiding crowded spaces, they're wearing face masks in public, and they're refraining from touching objects in public. Just to concentrate on the personal hygiene for a moment, we'll dive into that one first. And actually what we see is that there is obviously a bit of a hierarchy in markets, with Saudi Arabia being the least likely place that people have improved their personal hygiene, 72% of people in Saudi Arabia. And that moves up to 3/4 in Australia and Japan. And while they're at the bottom, you know, the least likely to improve their personal hygiene, or say they have, that is still huge. I mean, that is still the vast majority of those populations. We're noticing it is higher in those countries, those markets that are more concerned about the virus. Singapore, Thailand, Indonesia, or 84% of people in all those markets have improved their personal hygiene, and 85% in Malaysia. Interestingly, though, Hong Kong tops the league table, if you like, of markets changing their habits around personal hygiene. So there, 88% of all people have changed their habits, despite that market being one of the lowest in terms of fear. We're noticing again that women are changing their habits more than men, significantly more. So Hong Kong, Singapore, and Malaysia, that is true. It also increases by age in all markets, apart from Indonesia, which interestingly sees a decrease, sees younger people more likely to improve their personal hygiene. And introducing here the idea of tiered cities. So in many of our markets, the ones we're talking about here today, China, India, and Indonesia, we look at geography based on tiered cities, with tier 1 being the largest cities in those markets, and then goes down. So in India and Indonesia, those living in tier 1 cities are more likely, significantly more likely to improve their personal hygiene. Whereas in China, it's actually tier 2 cities, which are the second level down in terms of size. So that's an interesting difference. Just to focus on crowded spaces here for a second, because this one is going to impact us a lot when we think about economic recovery and when we think about opening up, and especially in an Asian context, where many, talking about those tiered cities, many of our markets in Asia and the Middle East are particularly dense markets and have large cities, and avoiding crowds in order to go to work isn't always the easiest thing to do. So similarly, 81% of all people are avoiding crowded spaces, and that we again see slight differences by country. Again, Saudi Arabia is the lowest, but it's still 76%. So still 3 in 4 people are avoiding crowded spaces in Saudi Arabia. Taiwan and UAE are next, with about 8 in 10 people. At the top of the list there, we have Malaysia and Singapore. 85% of Malaysians are avoiding crowded places, as are 84% of people in Singapore. Almost universally, older people are listening to that advice. They are staying inside. And again, that might link to why they have slightly less fear of contracting the virus. Women across most markets, again, are avoiding crowded spaces. And those working full-time in China, Thailand, and Indonesia. So I think that's going to ask big questions about when it's safe to return to work. And when we talk about safety to return to work, we move on to face masks and the wearing of face masks in public. We've seen there are massive cultural differences in face mask wearing. We knew this before we even started. Those of us who live in Asia and the Middle East here especially have seen, are aware that face masks are a part of daily life. Contrasting to the West, where that's not so true in markets such as the UK, US, Australia, and so on. And so what we can see here, if you can skip to the next slide, Will. Thank you. What we can see here is, despite it being a massive cultural thing in Asia to begin with, it's still increased by a huge percent, the idea of wearing masks in Asia and the Middle East. So when we started wave 1 across all markets, we found that half of people in Asia Pacific and the Middle East had said that they had worn a mask in the last 2 weeks. That has grown to now 8 in 10 people. And if we take a minute to look at just some examples of that shift, we can see some really interesting differences here. With Australia, although Australia is still only at 25% of people, only a quarter of people have said they've worn a mask in the last 2 weeks in our latest wave. Actually, that's 2.5 times increase on the original 10%. So that's a massive increase. There we're seeing slightly different demographics drive this. So it's actually men increasing the drive, younger people, parents and full-time workers. And then we see in the UAE that things have doubled to 8 in 10 people wearing a mask, driven by older people, married full-time. In Indonesia, the shift is a bit more steady, and those kind of blocks are slightly less steep, but it's still almost a 2-time shift. And in Singapore, we are seeing almost universal mask wearing, and that's a 3.5 time increase, and not surprising if you live in Singapore and are aware of the circuit breaker measures that mean we're not allowed outside without masks. So let's move on quickly to look at government measures and how people are reacting to those. So the government is obviously trying to keep us all safe. Our governments across the region are working in different ways. The support for those measures is remaining very high across most of the measures. So in cancelling large events, it's the vast majority of the population supporting, and the majority for temporarily closing all schools, except for Taiwan there, which is 1 in 5. Cancelling routine appointments in hospitals and operations, that has lower support, but there is still significant support within those measures. What we will focus on just for a second is those cancellations of large sporting events and concerts, because that has big impacts on spending, and obviously is a big sector in itself. So if we zoom into Thailand there, what we're seeing is that the cancellation of those events is really low among men. Men are not in support of that measure. Younger people are less likely to support those on low incomes and those less educated. And that's reflected broadly in Australia as well, those demographic differences. And across the region, younger people are less likely to support that. And we're going to see that in a minute in terms of entertainment as well. It's those young people who are looking for us as businesses to keep them entertained during the lockdown. So looking at media consumption, And we can see that news consumption has increased dramatically across the region, with vast majorities between 6 and 10 to 8 and 10 people in each market saying they have consumed more news media in the past 2 weeks due to the coronavirus. And what we're seeing with that in particular is an increase in older ages, especially in Saudi Arabia, Japan, Indonesia, and Hong Kong. Older people more likely to watch more news. And then those groups that are also impacted by especially things like the lockdown measures in different countries, or social distancing measures, and the impact that's going to have in their lives. So full-time workers are concerned, as are parents. Women are more likely to be concerned, and higher income groups are more likely to be concerned in some markets, Singapore, Thailand, and China. But let's start talking about our kind of consumer categories here, and think about this boredom that people are facing in markets where they've been staying at home for weeks or months by this point. And what we see is that young people and families, those with children and younger people themselves, they are the most likely to have an increase in their movie consumption. So across the board, movie consumption is up, not quite as much as news consumption, but in a normal time without the virus, these shifts in movie consumption would be huge in and of themselves. So young people drive that across all markets, and parents across most. And we're seeing men here as well drive that media consumption, that movie consumption, and the call for entertainment that comes from it. Australia, China, Singapore, and UAE, it's men. Whereas Indonesia, it's actually women driving this. So to focus on Singapore just for a second, to have an in-depth kind of look at how that's changed over time. And we can see when we look at the news content, that's gone up since our first wave. As Will mentioned, our first wave ran around mid-February. At that point, it was still the majority of people were watching more news content, whereas now that's jumped from 55% to 76% saying they are still watching more news week on week. So that's a lot more news. Movie consumption, again, although those numbers are not as big in themselves, the shift is huge. You've got an almost 4 times increase in people consuming more movies now than they did in the 2 weeks running up to that study. So let's move on to online shopping and start looking at some e-commerce sectors with this. So online grocery shopping first. And there's been a huge shift to online grocery shopping across the world, but especially in Asia Pacific here, and the Middle East has had some huge increases, with 50% of people saying that they are spending more money on grocery shopping in the past 2 weeks due to the virus. That's a large difference. And separately, forecasters are saying that in 2023, 4 out of the 10 biggest e-commerce players in the world are likely to be from Asia. And we're seeing that here. What we're also seeing is MENA have massive, a large drive of grocery, online grocery startups, and they're really filling that space. So we're really seeing our businesses fill up that gap that is demanded by the need for online groceries. We're also seeing that demand kind of increase significantly over time. So that's what those arrows are showing. So Singapore there, you can see there's been a 10 percentage point increase from the 2nd of April in the demand for online grocery shopping, 4 percentage points there in Saudi Arabia, and 6 percentage points in India. Demographics more likely to use online grocery shopping. Again, we're seeing parents almost universally doing this, and we can only assume that that's due to their time being taken up and being more precious due to the homeschooling and the entertainment of their children. Again, millennials and Gen X are the ones driving this in many markets: Australia, Singapore, Indonesia, Malaysia, Saudi Arabia. we're finding more millennials and Gen X driving it. Thailand, it's younger people. Women also are significantly higher in Hong Kong, Thailand, Japan, Indonesia, and India. Men are not significantly higher anywhere. And tier 1 cities in Indonesia and India. So let's look at some other e-commerce for a moment, and let's look at Australia specifically, and the demand again on entertainment as an e-commerce category this time, and on their spend on clothing online. So what we're seeing is that half of people have been either increased their spend on entertainment or on clothing, or they've had no change to that. So there's been no drop, and it's remaining steady. So that's a little different to the last slide. What we are seeing though is there's a significant difference here in the entertainment spend, again with men and women, where men are significantly more likely, as it stands right now, to have increased or not changed their spend in entertainment online in the past 2 weeks. That said, that has dropped significantly in the last 2 weeks. So that red 7 percentage point drop there shows that, sorry, since the 2nd of April, since last month, there has been a drop in men's entertainment spend. And conversely, we're seeing that there has been a little bit of a gain for millennials, but again, those two groups, baby boomers and millennials are far more likely to be spending online for entertainment. Clothing has seen a drop across the board, and maybe that's especially in Australia with the market starting to open up. People are ready to wait to get back into the shops to buy their clothing again. There has been a significant rise among both boomers and millennials though, with the fall coming from Gen Z there, and Gen X as well. So let's move on to talk about the about online delivery for a moment. And what we're seeing here is we're seeing that our food habits are changing a little. As we saw in the last time we looked at this too, it does vary a lot by region here. So the Middle East are far less likely to be ordering delivery food online in the past 2 weeks versus the increases there. If you look at UAE, for example, you have 18% increasing, but 55% decreasing their delivery of takeout food online. That's compared with Asia, where actually in most of Asia, we're seeing increases in online food delivery. That has dropped since last time we looked at this though. And also we're noticing that some markets, the decrease is larger than the increase, like Indonesia, or it's certainly growing in others. And Australia, it's remaining the same. And we can see on the right there that many people are choosing to prepare food at home as well. And those increases have been huge across the board. So let's jump in on some economic recovery data. We are looking at those three sections that Will mentioned earlier. We're looking at a couple of questions in each, and to quickly tell you about the markets we're looking at. So we are in field right now. We are coming out of field actually for our first wave across Asia Pacific and the Middle East for our first official wave of this economic recovery data. So this is giving you a snapshot in places that we have piloted that data, which is Australia, UK, and USA. Australia, the sample sizes there ranging from 3,500 people in the US to over 6,500 in the UK. And we're going to look at a couple of waves of that data rolled together, either 3 or 4 waves, depending on how long we have in each country there. So let's look first on how respondents are feeling about their economy. So by understanding how people are feeling, first off, about their economies, and then understanding how people have actually been impacted recently, we can really understand what's going to change in the economy and what we're going to be facing very soon. So how are people feeling about their economies? Well, most are predicting that their country's economy will hit a recession or depression in the next 12 months. That's the majority of the population in the UK and Australia, and the plurality of the largest group in the USA. Not many people are expecting a growth. Again, the US is slightly more optimistic there. And when we look at demographics, again, we can see that women are more likely to predict a recession, so are more pessimistic here. Also, those on a higher income, and in the US, those with a higher education. In Australia, Gen X and Gen Z are the most likely to predict a recession versus the millennials and boomers. So that reflects a little bit of those changing demographics that we were seeing earlier. So what concerns do people have? We have two types of concerns here. We have external factors, so what is happening to people at a whole economy level, and then individual factors, what is happening to them. So the concerns on global recession, slightly different question. This is asking whether people are very concerned or concerned about a global recession. We find that the vast majority are, and we are finding that rises with income in all of those markets. So those with more income are more likely to be concerned about a recession. So are married people in Australia and the UK. And it also rises with age in the US and the UK as well. In Australia, we're seeing the similar curve to the fear of contracting the virus, with actually boomers and Gen Z. It's an opposite curve because boomers and Gen Z are the ones that are more concerned there. When we look at personal economics and paying the bills, especially, we're seeing that, okay, this isn't as high, people aren't as scared as global recession there, but there are large proportions of populations in these markets, and I'm sure when we get the data back for Asia and the Middle East as well, in each of our individual markets, people are worried about paying the bills. As you might expect here, lower income people are more concerned in the UK and the US. In Australia, it's lower and middle incomes, with actually being higher incomes being significantly less concerned about paying bills. We're also again seeing that women here and those of working age groups are more likely to have concerns. So Will mentioned another section of our data is on people's working lives and what changes they're seeing there. And I think we're all concerned about productivity. I think especially as a lot of us are working at home, and concerned about the impact of that and other sectors not being able to open on the economy. So we're finding that half of people have witnessed a decrease in business activity in their place of work. This is particularly true of men in Australia and the UK, and also of lower income groups in Australia by a very long way. What's interesting here is that the UK and Australia, while the proportions among these three countries are very similar, the demographics are quite different. So in Australia, lower income groups are feeling that to a long way, whereas in the UK, there's no significant differences among people who earn different amounts. In Australia, it's the part-time workers who are feeling this, and we're about to talk about them a little bit more. Part-time workers are seeing the lack of productivity to a very large extent versus full-time, whereas in the UK, there is no significant difference either. And we can see similar things when we look at job security as well. Asking, compared to 1 month ago, how secure do you think your job is? 4 in 10 people in Australia feel that their job is less secure, 3 in 10 in the UK and the US. And again, there's very big contrasts into who feels that when you compare the UK and Australia. So in Australia, women feel more insecure. In the UK, it's men. It decreases by age in Australia, whereas it's the oldest age group who are feeling less secure in the UK. And it decreases by income in Australia, whereas the most well-off in the UK are feeling the least secure. There's also a difference here with part-time workers in Australia, with half of part-time workers feeling insecure in Australia versus 3 in 10 full-time workers. And there's no difference in that between full-time and part-time in the UK. Let's move to people's personal financial situations. We can see on this slightly complicated looking slide, what's actually happening here is the past 1 month is telling us how has your household's financial situation changed in the past 1 month, and how do you expect it to change in the next 12 months. And what we can see here is for most people, they have found that there has been no change in their financial situation. However, there is a concerning amount of people in each market who are saying it has got worse in the last 1 month. What we're noticing is that those people who are saying it has got worse in 1 month, thankfully that proportion falls when we say how is it going to change in the next 12 months when we look across the country. So people are feeling some pain now, but are slightly more optimistic about the 12-month outlook. Now I'm going to return to those part-time workers again, because what we found throughout this is that part-time workers are feeling more concerned about the situation in Australia, but that's not true in the UK. Whereas actually, when we look at the data here on who has had a change in their household financial situation in the past month, we see that part-time workers have had a significant worsening of their financial situation in both Australia and the UK. So in Australia, 54% of part-time workers have said their household financial situation has gotten worse in the past month, whereas that's only 34% of full-time workers. And in the UK, despite them saying being not significantly more likely to have concerns, and they are more significantly likely to be hit by a worsening financial situation. We're also finding women are more impacted in Australia and the US, and lower income overall. And who are the optimists? Well, those thinking that the economic outlook will get better in the next 12 months are significantly more likely to be men in Australia and the UK, younger people across all markets, and especially students in the UK, and those with a higher income in the US and the UK. So finally then, what is going to stick from all of these changes that we've seen and we've felt? How are we going to differ as time goes on after all of this changes? Well, we're asking a huge number of lifestyle statements about what people think will change and what they expect to change in their own personal habits as a result of this virus and the time they're spending. So this data we're looking at here is US data. We will have this data in Asia and the Middle East as of this week. And what we're seeing, are people more likely to work from home? Is work from home the new norm? Because we keep on hearing it is. Well, we're not seeing overwhelming love of working from home, but we do see a third of people in the US say they will work from home more often, and that they will travel much less for work in the future. What about consumer spend? This is likely to have a massive impact. So local businesses, I think people have really kind of understood the impact on the virus on local businesses, and are far more committed to spending locally in the future, with 2/3 saying that they will support local businesses much more. We also have almost half saying that they will make more use of online shopping, which may be a slight contradiction to that, but both things can obviously be true. In terms of payments, we're noticing that a third of people in the US here say they will use cash less in the future. We know that our markets here in Asia Pacific and the Middle East are far further forward with fintech and with e-payment across our markets. So we are expecting that to be higher among our markets, and we also think, I mean, I personally am wondering if this could be the surge needed to get the first cash-free societies within Asia. There's a lot more use of that electronic payment going on. And finally, how's the environment holding up? Environment was supposed to be the only real winner from this situation. Well, we are seeing in the US, which isn't the most environmentally friendly nation, but we are seeing that a third of people are committing to buy more green or sustainable produce. We are also seeing that a quarter of people are excited to go on vacation or holiday overseas, though, which is good news for our travel industries, but possibly not so much good news for the environment. So we've covered a large amount of data there. I apologize that I haven't left a bit more time for questions. What's the summary? As ever, when we look at this data, what we're seeing is a real mixed bag. We are seeing people get a bit more, want to change back to the lives they had a little bit more, with wanting more entertainment. They're feeling that boredom. They're wanting the government measures relieved a little bit. But we're also seeing that definitely not every group and every market is working in the same way. So we are seeing that women tend to be impacted more by the kind of day-to-day life issues around the virus, whereas with men, it's more about kind of being concerned about being entertained than having so much fear. In terms of the economy, it's a mixed bag. I think we're noticing that people are starting to feel the pressure right now, but they are being quite optimistic about the future. So we will certainly see more as time comes with that. So I'll hand back to Will to take a few questions in the time we have left. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Jake. Some really, really interesting data and insights there. Just before we get to questions, and I can see some coming in on the chat, so please do use that chat functionality. You can either send it just to all panelists or to one of us individually if you want to try and sort of remain anonymous. So we'll come back to those. I'll just give you a minute or so to write questions in while I talk about what's coming next from us. So we are going to be continuing our webinar series, so please do stay tuned for these. The next one's coming up. Next week, we have one that is focusing on the science. So we're in the very privileged position of being able to bring to you work from our academic team at Imperial College London. That will give you a window or a view into, one, the data that the scientists are looking at, and two, how they're thinking at this time. The one after that is going to be an exploration of YouGov's connected data. So we're going to bring you stories from around the world that we've seen from our brand tracking, so brands that have got the situation right, those that have got the situation wrong. We're also going to look at what are those consumer groups that are most valuable, and how should we be chasing them. There's also going to be more on our public data front. So as we develop our trackers, there is going to be some new data coming around mental health, as well as we're going to start publishing a very top layer of some of our financial or economic recovery data that Jake has just been through. So if that's what's coming from us next, if you do have any requests or information, please do in the first instance contact your local YouGov office or account lead. If you don't have one, then please do use our global email address. It is info@yougov.com, and we'll get back to you as soon as we possibly can. Hopefully, in the meantime, there have been a series of questions coming in. I'm just going to look at them now. But Jake, is there anything that you've seen on that question that you would like us to pick up on?
Yes, there are some, just to let you guys know a little about the data releases. We have all of this information on the first part already released in our all Asia Pacific markets and Middle Eastern markets. So that consumer monitor bit, the economic recovery side, a few people are asking when that's ready, and that will be published, some free parts this week and available, the deeper dive parts for Middle East and Asia Pacific will be ready this week as well for those deeper dives. There's a question on Australian transport and whether we have any insights into fear of using that. We don't have insights into fears, but we do have travel plans and public transportation over time. I'm just looking at some data for that now. And I can see that people are saying that they have been using all public transportation less often, specifically trains, 30% of people saying they're using that less often, buses 30%, taxis down 20%, and ride-hailing apps down 23%. So that's some information on transport in Australia. Any questions that are asking about specific data, if we can't answer them now, we will have a member of our team follow up with you and pass on the information we have too.
Fantastic. Thank you, Jake. There's one that's particularly caught my eye, and it's understand health and fitness trends. The question actually asked reference across the Middle East. Let me talk about, I haven't got precise Middle East data, someone can follow up on that. What I can talk about is what we've seen at a general picture globally, in that as countries moved into lockdown, there was actually a spike in fitness, where the population was allowed out of home during lockdown. What we saw is a general theme to increase in terms of fitness, taking part, going running, going cycling, buying fitness equipment. What we've then seen is that sort of early enthusiasm start to wane as lockdown has continued. So that's that one. The other one that I just wanted to pick up on, again, another really interesting question that we will be exploring in much more depth in later webinars. So the one I mentioned about looking at YouGov's Cube data. So, but the question is there an emerging audience segmentation for key industries such as CPG, automotive, or banking? I think the short answer to that is yes, there will be. What we are seeing is that there are certain consumer habits, certain consumer responses to the virus, as Jake has highlighted in depth throughout this presentation, that will impact future buying behavior and future consumer behavior. As a result, I think there are going to be some key audiences, ones that emerge this from, one, a change in habit, but two, have been more heavily or less heavily impacted financially, so that they will have greater spending power or not. That's definitely one to watch. Please do stay tuned for further webinars on that, because we are going to try and answer that question in depth. Jake, I think we've got time for maybe one or two more questions.
I have one more here asking, do we have any survey data on Malaysian expectation on festive season after the movement control order, Eid, Diwali and Halloween? And actually that brings up a really, really interesting question for the markets we're discussing today. So obviously we are covering the Middle East and Asia, and we have a lot of festive things going on, but most importantly right now we're in the middle of Ramadan. And I think that's going to be very interesting as we get the next few weeks data in for us to understand what impact this has had, especially on Ramadan in those markets, and how people's behavior is changing, you know, their food consumption behavior and things like that. I know there's a lot of drive from markets to think about our friends who are adhering to Ramadan by ordering food at different times of day to avoid sunset and so on. So I think that's going to be fascinating over the next couple of weeks.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Jake. I'm sorry we haven't got time to answer all of your questions. We will save them in the chat. We will come back to you as follow-up for those specific inquiries around elements of data. But my huge thanks to Jake and his team for presenting today, for drawing out those key insights and sharing some of that data. Thank you very much for joining us and for all of your questions. It's great to see such a high level of engagement, and we will get down to them as soon as possible. Please do stay tuned for further webinars. But it's thank you from Jake, it's thank you from me, and I hope you have a great day.